Welcome to Just One Q. I'm Dr. Melissa Horne, a diversity, equity, and inclusion advocate. In this podcast, I chat with industry experts and thought leaders about the latest trends related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Each episode, I ask just one question tied to current events. The goal is to leave you with the tools that you need to drive change in your own life, both personally and professionally. Now, this week's episode is going to be a special one. We're going to break from our regular format to bring you a special announcement about the Just One Q podcast and introduce you to a new voice you'll get to know. In my role as podcast host and in my role at Dialectic over the past 5 years, I've had the opportunity to speak with dozens of DEI experts, and I've learned alongside our audience through so many of the insightful conversations I've had. My hope is that as a listener, you've learned a lot too. Recently, I've taken on a new role in the world of DEI as the advisor of organizational culture at the Ontario Veterinary College at the University of Guelph here in beautiful Guelph, Ontario. And so with that, today will be my last day in the host chair of Just One Q. I am, however, leaving the podcast in very capable hands, and today I'm so excited, and I have the pleasure of introducing Dominique Attrell, who will be taking over as host. Dominique is a DEI learning professional who's passionate about designing learning solutions that shift workplace culture. As a member of the Dialectic team, Dominique has designed and facilitated anti-racism learning experiences in the healthcare, corporate, public benefit, and education sectors. And she has a real knack for helping individuals and teams push their learning edge, grapple with difficult questions, and practice relational skills. So, without further ado, Dominique, it's a pleasure to have you here and to welcome you to Just One Q.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Melissa. Melissa built this podcast from the ground up and has done such an amazing job at amplifying the voices of really great people in the DEI space. So it's an absolute privilege to pick up where you've left off and to carry this vision and this podcast forward.
So on today's show, Dominique and I are going to break from the usual Just One Q rule, and we're each going to have just one question each. I'm going to ask Dominique a question, and she's going to ask me one.
And I get to start. So my question to you, Dr. Melissa Horne, is, over the past several years of doing this podcast, what are some of the most important things that you've learned about DEI initiatives and what makes them successful?
Oh my goodness. Now I know how my guests feel. That's actually, I think, a lot tougher than it sounds because, as I mentioned, I think, over the past 3 years and I think over 50 episodes into the podcast, I've had the opportunity to talk with so many amazing people, and each person leaves me thinking a little bit differently about DEI, which for me, this has been such an amazing learning journey. But
Absolutely.
I think if I had to, I could distill it into 3 key points. And this is sort of an aggregate of some of the key things that I think I've heard my guests say over the last few years. So the first thing is that I think that for DEI initiatives to be successful, you need to have organizational readiness. And by that, I mean, I think the organization needs to be primed. And that means making sure that before you start anything, that you're communicating with employees and leaders about how these initiatives connect to their sphere of influence. So folks need to see and connect how DEI fits with their work and to feel empowered to be part of the organizational change. And so from a very practical perspective, the person down in purchasing needs to understand why DEI matters to them and to their role. And leaders need to understand how they're going to play a part. And they're going to be 2 very different ones. But I think sort of making sure that you take time to go on that internal communication spree is really important to getting buy-in from folks.
Absolutely. And what happens when that readiness isn't there?
I think people, they see this as sort of just another thing. They don't necessarily connect the importance to it. They may not feel personally invested in the same way as if you sort of make it concrete for them. And I think a lot of times, DEI stays in the abstract. And so, I've heard many people say like I get all this stuff, but like, what would it look like for me on a day-to-day basis? What does it mean to be more inclusive? I do X. And it's like, well, one example is, have you thought about when you have your team meetings? Have you noticed, are there some people who are, constantly kind of just showing up, looking out of breath and like frazzled? Maybe your 9 a.m. start is not working, for that person. Maybe you consider that we have 9:30 or 10 a.m. starts. And, you might see greater engagement. You might see more people show up.
Absolutely.
These are like little things that are within people's spheres of influence and power that they can start to think about through an equitable lens. So the first thing is having organizational readiness. The second thing, and this is where we're seeing this right now with a bunch of DEI, chief diversity officers are being laid off in the tech sectors, is that, the initiatives, they weren't given time to succeed. They weren't given sufficient resources. And, folks are saying, well, this didn't work. So the second point, I think, is that most DEI initiatives fail because there are insufficient resources. And so the flip side of that is that for DEI initiatives to be successful, companies actually really need to invest. And I mean, both in terms of financial resources and people resources.
And time, right? Just the time it takes to see things through and to plan.
Yeah, that was actually,
go for it.
That was my next point. I was going to say, change
amazing.
takes time. Yeah, change takes time. It requires like trial and error to find the initiatives that are going to work for your specific organization. So, I mean, there's, I think folks come in maybe with a playbook and they have ideas, but how it actually like operationalizes within a certain organization, within certain teams may be different. And that means companies have to be willing to invest financially in those people resources so that you can pilot, iterate, and roll these things out. But you need to have a solid budget. You need support from HR. You need support from middle managers, and from employees to make these changes actually happen. So I would say resourcing continues to be a major battle for folks in the DEI field and for organizations who want to see change.
Absolutely. And are there any kind of signs of hope? Are there companies or organizations that are doing this right? Have you seen any evidence of really well-resourced programs being successful?
That's a great question. So as I mentioned at the top of the show, I'm in a new role. And I think there's one particular school right now, the Ohio State University College of Veterinary Medicine, I think is doing a really, really good job in terms of investing into their DEI work. And, it's starting from the dean of the college all the way down. And I think they keep, the other part is that communication, that change will take time, right?
Yeah.
And reporting back to people and saying, what, we tried this pilot for 6 months. It didn't work. Here's what we learned. So we're going to adjust. But it requires a leader who's willing to back it up with those resources as well and to allow learning to happen. And that means sometimes things fail, but we still learn a lot from it. I'm trying to think of other ones off the top of my head. I'm really steeped in veterinary medicine right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it sounds like what you're saying too is that consistent leadership is another factor that's tied maybe to all three of these, is just to have somebody in the driver's seat who can see it through and who can ensure that the communication is happening and the organizational readiness is happening, and who's going to be sticking around for the duration of an initiative so that it has sort of strong leadership going forward.
Yeah, and I think that's important. A lot of organizations, I think, have internal champions who are, in the absence of sort of someone who's like stewarding like a big, organizational change project, people are doing it off the side of their desks. And so things, will happen, but then if a different priority, something that's within their portfolio comes up, they have to take that. And so that DEI initiative fails or it gets stalled. So having someone who is sort of, responsible for pushing that forward is really critical. I think that's the other thing too, is that there's a lot of really great intentions. And, you can walk into an organization and be like, there's so much that needs to be done, but sort of just picking small things that you can at least see from start to finish is so much better than like trying to take off a huge chunk and not see it happen. This is where I think I really like sort of the one of the ideas around reconciliation is small steps often, you know? And I think, but that's part of that organizational readiness. Let people know what they can expect,
Absolutely.
that we're going to be doing small things often.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for sharing and for reflecting on that. And you've done a really great job of sort of distilling everything that you've learned into a tidy little package for our audience. And that's not an easy task. I realize it's a difficult question. Is there anything else that comes to mind or anything else that you want to share?
I think the other final thing is that I think, what I've learned is that we said that like, strong leadership is really important, that DEI is everyone's responsibility. So kind of circling back to that organizational readiness and change is that we kind of need everyone to be involved and to make this work. And that means, that the cis white heterosexual man needs to feel empowered and involved and have a role in this as well. I think, you probably scroll headlines and you're seeing DEI backlash. People are throwing their hands up in the air. And that's because sometimes it can feel alienating for folks, depending on the approach. And that I think everyone needs to feel that this is something that they are empowered to support in terms of like organizational change, and that, everyone, regardless, as I mentioned before, that has a role in this.
Yeah.
And that means the folks that sometimes on paper hold the most power and privilege, but we need those folks as well as advocates, and to feel that there's a space for them in this work for change to happen as well. So that's
Absolutely.
I think my final point.
Yeah, that's a great reminder that it does take all folks, and that initiatives should aim to be inclusive of everybody, because it's a difficult thing to accomplish sometimes, to do DEI without alienating somebody. And it's the challenge of education too. How do we bring those people alongside? How do we give them a role, make them feel empowered, make them feel part of the process and part of the result too? So that's a really great reminder of the importance of including everybody and bringing them all along. So thank you so much for that. And I believe that now it's your turn, Melissa.
Yes.
You have a question for me.
That's right. Okay, so I'm out of the hot seat now. All right, so I get to turn the tables and ask you, Dominique. Tell the listeners, let them get to know you a bit. So what has been your path to DEI work, and how does that inform your approach?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's a complicated one too, because the path has been long and winding, and I've done a lot of different jobs in the course of my career. So I'm going to go back sort of to the beginning and let people know that I'm a geographer by training, which means I've spent a lot of time thinking about how power and politics play out on the landscape and on natural resource use, and also how it shapes the built environment and the decisions that we make about, what we're putting where and how we build things. So geographers typically look at social structures like class systems, patriarchy, and larger economic systems like capitalism, to understand the ways that humans use space and resources, and also non-human beings. So I guess I can say that long before I was in DEI work officially, I was very interested in social critique and in understanding, the bigger structural causes of things, like how do we decide where it's acceptable to mine or to maybe allow for water impacts? Who gets to decide how many fish can be harvested this year? Or what kind of specific requirements are we going to establish for this wood or paper product to be marketed as sustainable, for example? So these are sort of the questions that were occupying my mind. And my interest in these questions transitions actually pretty seamlessly to the land of DEI. It means that I'm always asking, who benefits from this? Who gets to decide and why? What are the assumptions and the power dynamics and the systems that are the root causes of the injustices that we see in workplaces? Are these DEI initiatives actually addressing that, or are they in some way kind of performative? So I do bring that a little bit of a critical lens to the work of DEI, and I am interested in those structures. And that's something that I think our listeners who stick with this podcast are going to hear come out in my questions and in my conversations with DEI experts for sure.
And I think, that's perfect, because I think right now that's where folks are. If we're trending towards that way right now. We're looking at what are the historical and present day barriers that are creating inequities, and bringing that lens to the show, bringing that lens to the work that you do at Dialectic, I think has really made the learning snippets and the training and workshops that you design so powerful. Because I think, organizations are these microcosms within these larger structures, right? So thinking about how did we get here, what is actually going to change once we do this is such an important question that goes back to that change takes time, and it means addressing the right problem at the beginning and asking those tough questions. So
yeah, we've all seen DEI initiatives that fall flat because they feel a bit like a Band-Aid, or they are performative, or people are trying but they don't have that foundation that you described. And so I think it's really critical for people to bother doing a bigger root cause analysis and digging a little deeper. And I hope that in my conversations with our podcast guests, we're going to get to do that and push a little bit deeper into the question of why is this existing in the first place? Why are we having these problems? Why are workplaces set up this way to begin with? And really challenging some of the ideas there and challenging the idea of normal, challenging, where does that come from and why do we think that things are set up this way? And what does it take to make those changes? So that's the type of question that I'm super interested in. And the other thing I'll say about myself is that I'm an educator through and through. So in practice and at heart. And I've spent several years teaching science in schools and doing community-based environmental education as a geography and environmental expert before pivoting into my current role, which is more about designing, memorable DEI learning experiences for all kinds of folks in all kinds of workplaces. So what makes me tick, and I guess the common thread, is really seeing that light bulb turn on for someone. And I'm super passionate about giving people every opportunity to learn and grow and recognizing that that looks different for different people. And so when it comes to the DEI conversations on this podcast, something I'd really like to focus on is the question of how can we best get this message to people? So how can we take this knowledge from a DEI expert and really put it into practice? How can we take this wisdom and allow it to actually change how things are done in your workplace and in my workplace? And so really thinking about communication, education, that piece of how you get people on side, regardless of identity. And that's something that is going to occupy a lot of space in my mind as I move forward in conversations with our DEI guests.
I think that's critical. These terms have become so ubiquitous right now in sort of the common parlance, and people are like, cool, what does that look like for me? Right? Yes. Like, how do I action this? What is literally, people are like, how would that change how I interact with someone? And so the more that we can make it practical, operationalize it for folks, the more that we can make it relevant to people's, day-to-day experiences. I think it's really, an exercise in knowledge translation and communication. Yes. And meeting folks where they are. I'm really excited to see where you take the show. I couldn't be more thrilled that you're going to be the new host, because I think you are going to bring your perspective, the things that you're passionate about, to each interview. And, having delivered some of the trainings that you've designed and just, watched people's engagement with them, I know that the same magic's going to happen on the podcast as well. So I'm super excited.
Well, thanks
for our listeners.
Yeah, that means a lot to me to hear you say that. So thank you so much. And of course, as the Just One Q team moves forward, I want to continue to amplify worthy voices in the same way that you've done. And I want to, dig deep into those DEI questions that can help us build better and more equitable workplaces and communities. And you've set us up with such a strong foundation, and your track record on this podcast has been just absolutely phenomenal. A lot of the guests that you've had have just been extremely impactful to listen to. And I think that your touch in curating who those guests are has been really, really insightful and top-notch. So it's a pleasure to follow in your footsteps, Melissa, and to take over on this journey. So I will say to our listeners that, as always, if you or someone you know would make a great featured guest on Just One Q, please reach out. You can find my email in the show notes. And to find more about Melissa's ongoing work, where can we find you, Melissa?
LinkedIn is probably the best place to connect with me.
Great. So we'll drop a link to Melissa's LinkedIn profile in the show notes as well. And Melissa, I want to thank you so much again for your warm welcome and for all of the work that you've put into this podcast over the years.
Well, it's been my pleasure. And I just want to thank all my guests for making it great, and to thank the folks who have listened for staying with us and supporting us. And so for one last time, I'm Dr. Melissa Horne, and this is Just One Q.
Thanks for joining us, and see you next time.